auctioneer rapped the gavel down at $295 on a crisp, clear November morning. In 2005, at the Coos County North Country Estate auction outside Berlin, New Hampshire, and the slim man in the charcoal cashmere overcoat at the side of the auction tent let out a thin, scornful laugh through his nose that turned the heads of every Berlin pulp mill mechanic along the chain link. Sloan Whitcomb Pierce was 51, 6'1", and Boston fit, sandy gray hair clipped close and combed back from a high tanned forehead, a thin, clean-shaven jaw, sharp pale gray eyes behind gold-rimmed Persol sunglasses pushed back on his head, a fresh winter ski tan from a long sugarbush weekend. He wore a slim charcoal cashmere-and-wool overcoat over a slim charcoal gray three-piece suit, a pale yellow silk pocket square in the breast pocket, a wine burgundy regimental striped silk tie, polished black Italian Oxford shoes, a slim oxblood Hermes attaché case in his left hand, a heavy gold pinky ring set with a small carnelian intaglio sat on his left pinky. Sloan ran the New England acquisitions desk for a Boston hedge-funded ski resort consortium assembling Coos County land for a proposed Errol to Pittsburg ski and condominium expansion. The estate auction had been called for a Berlin probate parcel the consortium had been quietly assembling for 3 years. The 1962 Brockway Husky 158 wrecker at the back of the auction list had been listed as personal property on the parcel since 1990, and Sloan had told the auctioneer privately the consortium had been planning to scrap the truck and clear the lot for $50 cash. The 24-year-old shop mechanic in the deeply faded red and black Mackinaw at the back of the bidders had just outbid the consortium for $295 against Sloan's casual $60 opening shot, and Sloan was making sure the Berlin North Country mechanics understood the joke. Atticus Bisbee folded the auction slip into the inside pocket of his Mackinaw and walked through the cold gravel to the truck. The Brockway Husky 158 was 21 feet of long-nose conventional cab, heavy iron. The chrome Brockway Husky dog hood ornament standing on the front of the long hood. The cab faded, Brockway forest green oxidized to chalky pine needle along the panels and rust brown along the lower door edges. The chrome Brockway letters across the grill pitted, side cab fender mirrors snapped. The Holmes 850 boom with a hand-cranked twin-drum winch listing 2 degrees right with both cables frayed. The wooden cargo deck rotted, 3 of the 8 tires flat. The word junk spray-painted in flaking maple syrup amber block letters across the driver's door. A heavy steel spare tire carrier was mounted on a hand-welded arm under the front bumper. The spare tire long since rotted off, the carrier arm still bolted firmly to the chassis. Atticus had grown up 6 miles north of where this truck had last been parked on a back road off Route 16 outside Errol. His grandfather, Elliot Bisbee, was waiting at the trailer. Elliot was 76, a retired Brown Company logging camp cook who had run the kitchen at Brown's Pittsburg camp for 41 years between 1948 and the mill's closure in 1989. 5'8", short and barrel-chested with a slight stoop, snow-white hair clipped close, a thick white mustache, deep watery hazel eyes, in a kitchen pale face lined by 40 winters at a wood-fired range, large knotted hands. Wire-rim half-glasses on a leather cord hung around his neck. He wore a heavy red and black buffalo plaid wool Mackinaw coat, buttoned to the throat over a faded gray heavy twill work shirt, under a stained cotton chef's apron-style vest with 2 front pockets, dark gray, heavy twill work pants, scuffed brown leather lace-up snow boots, and a plain dark brown leather belt with a worn brass buckle. A blue speckled enamel coffee mug sat clipped to a hook on his vest. Elliot set one liver-spotted hand on the rusted front bumper of the Brockway and stood there a long minute. He spoke quietly. He said, "Son, you bought Octave Pelletier's old Husky." Octave Pelletier had run Pelletier North Country Recovery out of a small clapboard shop on Route 16 outside Errol from 1973 until the chain snap, working the mountain switchbacks above Pittsburg and the spring log haul roads of the Brown Company camps in the upper Connecticut Lakes country, pulling stuck brown log trucks off back grades and overturned mill trucks out of the wet November switchbacks. He had built the Holmes 850 wrecker, Boom himself, onto the Brockway's rear deck in 1975 with the help of two welders from the Brown Company's Berlin paper mill shop on a long October weekend. He had married a Pittsburg girl named Coralie Lacroix in 1968, and they had a daughter, Malis, born in 1969. Octave had died in November of 1990. He had been at a Brown Company log landing above Pittsburg in late afternoon, working a chain snap recovery on a stuck D9 dozer when a worn chain link parted under load and the recoiling chain end whipped across the landing and struck Octave at the back of the neck. He had died at the scene. He was 57 years old. Malis was 21 and a music student at the New England Conservatory in Boston. The Brockway had been recovered by another wrecker out of Berlin and parked behind the Pelletier shop on Route 16. Coralie had paid the property tax on the shop and the truck for 11 years, until she remarried in 2001 and moved to Concord. The lot was let go to Coos County for back taxes in 2003 and quietly bought by the Boston Ski Resort Consortium in 2004 as part of the larger Errol parcel. The Brockway had been listed in the probate court inventory and consigned to the auction. Atticus had been at the auction because his grandfather had heard from a retired Brown Company sawyer that Octave Pelletier's truck was finally being sold. They winched the Brockway onto Atticus's borrowed gooseneck trailer. Sloan Whitcomb Pierce stood at the side of the auction tent in his charcoal cashmere overcoat and watched, the slim oxblood Hermes attaché case in his left hand, and as Atticus pulled out, he called across the gravel that when the boy was ready to admit defeat, the consortium would arrange disposal for $50 cash. Atticus did not answer. Elliot climbed into the cab of the trailer truck, and they drove the 8 miles north up Route 16 to Elliot's red cedar timber frame shop behind his small clapboard cottage on a back road outside Errol, the dead Brockway rocking behind them on the salted highway, the Holmes 850 booms pointing at the cold gray November sky like two crooked fingers. The restoration would take 19 years. Nobody knew that on the drive north. Atticus worked his day job at a small heavy truck shop in Berlin during the week and drove 12 minutes north on Route 16 to Elliot's shop every Saturday and most Sundays. They started with the cab corners because Elliot insisted. The Brockway's rear cab corners had rusted through from 40 New Hampshire winters, and they cut out the rotted steel and welded in fresh 20-gauge sheet over a long weekend. They pulled the Continental L525 inline 6 gasoline engine out of the truck and tore it down on a stand. The bearings were salvageable, the crank true. The head needed a careful regrind. They pulled the 5-speed Spicer manual and pressed new bushings into the shift tower. The first long North Country winter went into the engine and into stories about Octave Pelletier. Elliot told Atticus about the night in 1979 when Octave pulled a Brown Company milk truck out of a Connecticut Lakes Creek at -18 and refused payment, except for a jar of maple syrup-glazed Camp Donuts. He told Atticus about the morning in 1984, when Octave hauled a snapped D8 out of an upper Connecticut Lakes bog and let the contractor pay him in 3 cords of seasoned yellow birch. He told stories about Coralie Pelletier's tarte au sucre. The second year, they sand-blasted the salt-rusted frame down to clean steel. By the 5th year, the cab came off. In the 7th year, Elliot slowed. He had cataract surgery on both eyes in the spring and was 3 months recovering. He came home seeing better than he had in 15 years, and his hands still worked. He told Atticus the truck would wait. By the 9th year, the Brockway was a roller. In the 11th year, Atticus's daughter was born, and the work paused. By the 14th year, Elliot sat more than he stood. He worked from a folding chair beside the stove, the wire-rim half-glasses on the leather cord, the blue enamel coffee mug clipped to his vest, and pointed at what to do next. Through all those years, Sloan's slim charcoal BMW 5 Series drove past the foot of Elliot's gravel road on Route 16 on his way to a consortium site visit, the slim oxblood Hermes attaché case visible on the passenger seat. The BMW always slowed at the bottom of the road, but never quite turned in. By the 16th year, the Brockway was painted. They had wet sanded and primed and laid down a deep, glossy Brockway forest green that matched a faded snapshot Elliot had of the truck from 1976. And they had masked off the driver's door with blue painter's tape around a rectangle where the flaking maple syrup amber junk paint still showed through, and they had left it there. Atticus did not know why. He just left it. By the 18th year, the Holmes 850 booms were rebuilt with fresh aircraft-grade twin-drum cables. By the 19th year, the Brockway was nearly whole. They had not yet pulled the front bumper spare tire carrier for re-galvanizing. The carrier was the last thing on the list because Elliot always said you start with what makes the truck move and you finish with what catches the spare when she blows on a back grade. On a cold, clear morning of November the 8th of the 19th year, Atticus pulled into Elliot's red cedar shop with a fresh new black wall spare tire and a stainless steel bolt kit for the carrier. He was 43. The dark brown at his temples had gone steady silver. The small white scar across his right palm from a sheet metal edge in 2017 was a faint line. His hands had the thickness of a man who had spent half his life under hoods. Elliot was 95. He sat on his folding wooden chair beside the shop wood stove with a heavy plaid wool blanket over his knees. The wire-rim half-glasses on the leather cord settled on his nose, the blue enamel coffee mug clipped to his apron vest. Atticus unbolted the spare tire carrier arm from the chassis and set the carrier across 2 sawhorses at the workbench. He started to wire brush the inside of the hollow steel carrier arm, where the new spare would mount, and he stopped. The rear end of the hollow carrier arm had been welded shut with a small steel access plate. The factory drawing called for an open rear end with a small drain hole. The closed plate was hand-applied and not factory original. Atticus set down the wire brush. He took a small ball-peen hammer and a thin, cold chisel and cracked along the welded edge of the access plate. The plate hinged downward on the unwelded lower edge under the chisel. Inside the sealed hollow chamber of the carrier arm, wrapped in 2 layers of waxed butcher paper bound with brown twine, was a small flat oilcloth bundle. He carried the bundle to the workbench under the clip-on lamp and cut the twine and unfolded the oilcloth 2 layers deep. Inside were 4 things. There was a tight roll of folded $20 bills wrapped with a piece of brown twine, 105 bills in 1980s Federal Reserve paper, totaling $2,100. There was a small, heavy brass log mark stamp tool, the working face cast with 3 small initials, and the brass shank engraved with the words Brown Company / Pittsburg Camp / 1934 along the side. There was a small black and white photograph mounted on stiff paperboard showing a small girl of about 4 standing on a counter at the Brown Company Camp Commissary, wearing a small white camp store apron with the Brown Company log mark embroidered in dark brown on the chest, the date, August 1973, written on the back in pencil, and there was a folded single sheet of plain yellowed lined paper, the creases brittle, the ink slightly faded but legible. Atticus unfolded it. The handwriting was small and careful and slanted slightly to the right. The letter was dated November the 8th of 1990. It read, "To Melis. The cash is for whatever a young woman needs at 21 when she is learning to play her violin in a city far from the Connecticut lakes. The stamp is your grandfather Honoré's. He carried it as a Brown Company log marker at the Pittsburg camp from 1934 until he retired in 1962 and gave it to me on my 18th birthday in 1951. The photograph is of you the morning your grandfather brought you down to the commissary to weigh the first sugar of the season. I am welding these inside the spare tire carrier because a chain link on the upper landing has been showing wear this autumn, and I do not want them lost if anything happens at Pittsburg this November. The truck is yours when you are old enough to drive her without breaking her. Your father, Octave Pelletier, Errol, New Hampshire, November 8th, 1990. Atticus sat on the workbench. He read the letter twice. He handed it to his grandfather, and Elliot held it in both hands and read it once through the wire-rim half-glasses and set it down. He said quietly, "Octave wrote this 7 days before the chain snapped at the landing. The girl never knew." They drove south to Concord the next Saturday. Elliot had called a Brown Company retiree whose niece played second violin in the New Hampshire Music Festival, and the niece had given them a current address for Melis Pelletier Lacroix in a quiet West End neighborhood of Concord. They drove down Route 16 and Interstate 93 under a clear, cold blue November New Hampshire sky and pulled into a small graveled lot in front of a modest clapboard 2-story house with a hand-painted wooden sign above the side studio door reading Pelletier Lacroix Violin Studio. The woman who came to the studio door in a soft charcoal silk blend cardigan was 55 years old. She had Octave Pelletier's broad shoulders and her father's deep, watery hazel eyes. She wore a soft charcoal silk blend cardigan over a faded burgundy cotton blouse, slim charcoal trousers, polished oxblood leather low-heel ankle boots, a thin silver violin scroll pendant on a thin silver chain at her throat, and a thin silver wedding band on her left ring finger. Elliot spoke first. He said, "Ma'am, I knew your father. He worked on his Brockway in my shop in 1983. My grandson here bought the Husky at the Berlin estate auction 19 years ago, and we have been restoring her ever since. And we found something welded inside her front bumper spare tire carrier that belongs to you." Milas's face changed. She brought them into a small studio music room, and they sat at a small maple chamber music table, and Atticus set the 4 items down one at a time. The cash first, then the logmark stamp, then the photograph. He saved the letter for last. Malis picked up the brass logmark stamp. She turned it slowly between her fingers and read the engraving along the brass shank. She said her grandfather Honoré had come down to Pittsburg from Quebec in 1929 on a Brown Company crew and had worked the Pittsburg camp commissary as a log marker for 28 years, that the family had been told the stamp had been sold to a Berlin antiquarian in 1995, and that she had been looking through Brown Company retiree estates for 30 years for that stamp. She picked up the photograph. She held it for a long time. She read the letter twice. She did not cry until the second reading. She asked finally if she could see the truck. They drove her north to Errol the next morning. Malis stood in the open bay of Elliot's red cedar shop and walked slowly around the Brockway 3 times. She ran her hand along the chrome Brockway Husky dog hood ornament on the front of the long hood and the chrome Brockway letters across the grill. She stood at the driver's door where the flaking maple syrup amber junk was still masked off in blue tape. She turned to Atticus and she asked the price. Atticus looked at his grandfather. Elliot laid both hands on the table and said, "Ma'am, the truck is yours, but not the way you mean. We are going to finish her. We are going to paint over the door so the junk is gone. And then we are going to drive her down Route 16 to the empty clapboard lot outside Errol, where Pelletier North Country Recovery stood until November of 1990. And we are going to paint your father's name on the door in clean white the way he had it in 1973. The boy paid $295 at auction. The truck is his on the paper. The work is his by the doing. But the name on the door belongs to your father and your grandfather and you. They finished the Brockway through that winter. Malis drove up from Concord every other Sunday. On the morning of May the 18th of the 20th year, they rolled the Husky out of Elliot's shop under a clear blue New Hampshire sky and drove her in convoy down Route 16 to the empty clapboard lot outside Errol, where Pelletier North Country Recovery had stood. Atticus handed Malis a small can of deep forest green paint and a 1-inch brush. Malis climbed up on the running board and she painted out the flaking maple syrup amber junk on the driver's door. She waited an hour. She opened a can of clean white lettering paint, and in her father's careful slant, she painted across the door, in clean, clear letters, Pelletier North Country Recovery, established 1973, old enough to drive her without breaking her. She stepped down. A slim charcoal BMW 5 Series sedan went by on Route 16. Sloan Whitcomb Pierce was driving. He slowed almost to a stop. He looked at the Brockway at the empty clapboard lot with the forest green door and the clean white lettering. He looked at the 4 people on the gravel. He did not laugh. He drove on. The Brockway sits on Route 16 outside Errol today, and the sign on the door reads, Pelletier North Country Recovery, established 1973. Malis teaches violin out of her small Concord studio. The $2,100 sits in a small lockbox at her studio. The 1934 Brown Company logmark stamp sits beside it. The 1973 photograph is framed above her music stand. The letter is in a small fireproof safe in her closet. She reads it once a year on the 8th of November. If you ever see an old Brockway Husky 158 parked on Route 16 outside Errol with the words Pelletier North Country Recovery painted on the door in clean white, slow down. Roll the window down and listen. There is a story in that truck that a Boston developer in a cashmere overcoat would have arranged disposal for $50 cash, and the work was always for the daughter. Subscribe to Iron Hook Stories for a new story every day. Thank you for watching.